The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of scorching June day in 1882 when the Texas sun turned Dalhart into a furnace and every breath felt like inhaling hot sand. Julia Morgan held the thin paper in trembling hands, reading the words over and over until they blurred through her tears. Foreclosure proceedings final, property seized, 30 days to vacate. 23 years old and she had nothing left, not even the small ranch house her father had built with his own hands before consumption took him 6 months ago. She stood on the porch of what was no longer her home, staring out at the brown prairie grass that stretched endlessly toward distant mesas. The cattle were long gone, sold off to pay medical bills that had done nothing to save her father. The chickens had stopped laying weeks ago from the heat and lack of proper feed. Now even the house itself was gone, claimed by Harold Whitmore at the First Bank of Dalhart for missed payments Julia had no way of making. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and her father had worked himself to the bone, trying to make this patch of hard Texas soil into something resembling prosperity. All of it gone. Julia crumpled the telegram and shoved it into the pocket of her worn calico dress. She would not cry, not where the neighbors might see. The few remaining ranchers in the area were struggling just as badly, and she would not add to their worries with her own grief. She had 30 days to figure out where a single woman with no family and no money could possibly go in a town as unforgiving as Dalhart. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider approached from the direction of town, moving at an easy canter despite the heat. Julia shaded her eyes, trying to make out who would be visiting at this hour when most sensible people stayed inside. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the massive frame of Vaughn Blake, a man she had seen perhaps a dozen times in the 3 years since he had appeared in Dalhart, like something out of a legend. Vaughn Blake wasn't the sort of man you forgot. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun when he passed. His arms were thick with muscle from years of trapping, hunting, and surviving in the mountains north of town, and his chest strained against whatever shirt he wore. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and his face was all hard angles and weathered tan, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He rarely came to town, and when he did, people whispered. Some said he had killed a man back east. Others claimed he was running from the law. Most just knew him as the mountain man who traded furs and occasionally signed on for dangerous jobs that required someone who feared neither beast nor bullet. Julia had spoken to him exactly once, 3 years ago when he had helped her father repair a broken wagon wheel on the road outside town. Her father had invited him to supper as thanks, and Vaughn had accepted with quiet courtesy. That surprised them both. He had said perhaps 20 words the entire evening, eating with precise manners that seemed at odds with his wild appearance, and then disappeared back into whatever solitary existence he preferred. Julia remembered thinking his eyes held a deep sadness, something old and permanent that he carried like a physical weight. Now those same eyes studied her from atop a large buckskin horse as he reined to a stop before her porch. Vaughn touched the brim of his hat in greeting, the gesture somehow formal despite his rough appearance. He wore dark trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms, and a gun belt that looked well used but clean. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "Heard about your trouble in town." Julia straightened her spine, determined not to show weakness. "News travels fast. Always does." Vaughn dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements surprisingly graceful for someone so large. He tied his horse to the porch rail and studied the house with an appraising eye. "Your father built this place solid. Shame to lose it." "I cannot pay what the bank wants." The words tasted like ash. "I cannot pay anything at all." Vaughn was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the house to the small barn, the empty corral, the well with its wooden cover. Julia felt heat creep up her neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. She knew what this property must look like to someone like him, someone who clearly managed to survive on his own. It looked like failure. "How much does Whitmore want?" Vaughn asked. Julia blinked. "I do not see how that is your concern." "How much?" The blunt question left no room for deflection. Julia swallowed hard. $800 for the missed payments and the foreclosure fees, and God knows what else he added on. I have $63 to my name, and that will not even get me a stagecoach ticket anywhere worth going. Vaughn nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. I will be back. He untied his horse and swung back into the saddle before Julia could form a response. She stepped to the edge of the porch, confusion warring with the stubborn pride that was about all she had left. Mr. Blake, I do not need your pity. He looked down at her, and something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. Never thought you did. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode back toward town at a ground-eating gallop that sent dust swirling in his wake. Julia stood watching until he disappeared, wondering what on earth had just happened. She spent the rest of the day packing the few belongings she could not bear to leave behind: her mother's wedding ring, which her father had kept in a small wooden box, the family Bible with birth and death dates inscribed in her father's careful hand, a quilt her grandmother had made, now worn soft with age, clothing, a few books, the tin cup she had drunk from as a child. Everything fit into 2 carpet bags, a testament to how little she had ever owned. By evening, the heat had barely lessened. Julia made a simple supper of beans and the last of her cornbread, eating without tasting, her mind spinning through impossible options. She could try to find work as a seamstress, though Dalhart barely had enough wealth to support the one seamstress already in business. She could become a laundress, breaking her back over hot water and lye soap for pennies. She could leave town entirely, try her luck in Dallas or Fort Worth, though the thought of those big cities terrified her more than she wanted to admit. The knock on her door came just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Julia opened it to find Vaughn Blake standing on her porch once again, his large frame silhouetted against the dying light. He held a folded paper in one hand. "It is done," he said simply, and handed her the paper. Julia unfolded it with shaking fingers. Her eyes struggled to make sense of the words in the dim light. Deed of property, her name, Julia Eleanor Morgan, written in official script. The property described in legal terms she barely understood. And at the bottom, a seal from the First Bank of Dalhart, showing the debt paid in full. She looked up at Vaughn, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "What is this?" "Your property, free and clear." "How did you—" "Mr. Blake, I cannot—" Words failed her entirely. The paper crinkled in her grip. Vaughn leaned against the porch post, his muscled arms crossed over his broad chest. In the fading light, he looked even more formidable, like something carved from the mountains themselves. "Had money saved. No use for it. You needed it more." Julia felt tears burning her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "I cannot accept this. It is too much. I could never repay you." "Not asking for repayment." "Then what are you asking for?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the hysteria of someone whose entire world had just tilted sideways. Vaughn was quiet, his eyes on the darkening horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was even lower than usual. "Your father was kind to me when most people crossed the street to avoid me, invited me to his table like I was a civilized man instead of something that wandered down from the hills. Figure I owed him, and you. My father would not want me to be a charity case." "Not charity." Vaughn met her eyes directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Paying a debt, keeping a good woman from losing the only home she has. Call it whatever you want, but the deed is in your name, and Whitmore cannot touch it." Julia looked down at the paper again, at her name in bold black ink, ownership, security, a future, however uncertain. The tears she had been fighting spilled over, and she swiped at them angrily with her free hand. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Vaughn pushed away from the post, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. "Should get back before full dark. You need anything? I have a cabin about 6 miles north in the foothills. Follow Cottonwood Creek until you see the rock formation that looks like a bear. Cabin is another 1/4 mile past that." "Mr. Blake." "Vaughn." He was already moving toward his horse. "Name is Vaughn." Julia stepped off the porch, still clutching the deed. "Vaughn, thank you. I do not know how to thank you properly." He mounted his horse and looked down at her one more time. "Take care of that place. That is thanks enough." Then he was gone, riding into the purple twilight like a phantom. Julia stood in her yard, the deed pressed against her chest, and wondered if she had somehow dreamed the entire day. She did not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vaughn Blake handing her that paper, his expression unreadable. $800. More money than she had ever seen at once in her life. He had given it to a banker he probably despised for a woman he barely knew because her dead father had once shared a meal with him. By dawn, Julia had made a decision. She could not repay the money, but she could do something. She spent the morning baking, using the last of her flour and the eggs she managed to coax from her stubborn hens. Bread, biscuits, and a molasses cake that used up her entire supply of the precious sweetener. She packed everything carefully in a basket, saddled her father's old mare, and set out following Vaughn's directions. Cottonwood Creek was easy enough to find, a thin ribbon of water that somehow survived the Texas heat. Julia followed it north into the foothills where the land began to rise and juniper trees provided patches of shade. The bear-shaped rock formation appeared after about an hour of riding, a massive sandstone boulder weathered into the rough shape of a rearing bear. Julia's heart beat faster as she urged the mare forward. Vaughn's cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by scrub oak and juniper. It was larger than she expected, built from rough-cut logs with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around two sides. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat, and she could hear the sound of someone chopping wood. She found him behind the cabin, stripped to the waist in the morning sun, an axe in his hands. Julia's breath caught at the sight of him. His back was a map of muscle that flexed and moved with each swing of the axe, his shoulders impossibly broad, his arms thick as tree trunks. Sweat gleamed on his tanned skin, and dark hair fell forward into his face. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this task 1,000 times, each movement precise and powerful. Vaughn must have heard her mare because he stopped mid-swing and turned. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then Vaughn set down the axe and reached for the shirt he had draped over a nearby stump. "Miss Morgan." He pulled the shirt on but did not button it, and Julia had to force herself to look at his face instead of the strip of muscled chest still visible. "Something wrong?" "No, yes. She took a breath and tried again. I brought you some things to say thank you properly." She dismounted and retrieved the basket, acutely aware of how small her offering seemed. Vaughn took the basket and peered inside, his expression unreadable. "You did not have to do this." "Yes, I did." Julia straightened her shoulders. "You gave me back my home. The least I can do is make sure you have something decent to eat." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Vaughn's face. "Think I cannot cook for myself?" "I think you probably cook game over an open fire and call it a meal." Julia gestured at the cabin. "When was the last time you had fresh bread? Or a proper cake?" Vaughn looked down at the basket again, and Julia could have sworn she saw his throat work as he swallowed. "Been a long time," he admitted quietly. "Then you will accept this," and Julia hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I would like to bring you a meal once a week, to repay you properly." Already said no repayment needed. "And I'm saying I need to do this." Julia met his eyes, willing him to understand. "Please, let me keep some of my pride intact." Vaughn studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Finally, he nodded. "Once a week, if it makes you feel better." Relief flooded through her. "It does. Sunday afternoons? I could bring dinner. Sundays work." They stood there in awkward silence, neither quite sure what to say next. Finally, Vaughn gestured toward the cabin. "Want to see inside, since you will be visiting regular?" Julia nodded, curiosity overwhelming her natural caution about being alone with a man she barely knew. Vaughn led her around to the front porch and through a solid wooden door. The interior of the cabin surprised her. She had expected something rough and barely livable, but Vaughn clearly knew how to make a home. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and a rocking chair near the window. Furs covered the floor and hung on the walls. A ladder led to a loft above, presumably where he slept. Everything was clean and organized, almost obsessively neat. "You have books," Julia said, moving closer to the shelves. Poetry, philosophy, several novels by Dickens and Hawthorne. Not what she would have expected from a mountain man. "Used to read a lot. Before." Vaughn set the basket on the table. "Before what?" His jaw tightened. "Before I came here. Before I decided people were not worth the trouble." The bitterness in his voice made Julia turn to face him. Yet you saved my home. That was different. How? Vaughn was silent, his eyes distant. Finally he said, "Your father looked at me like I was human. Most people see something dangerous they want to avoid. He saw a man who needed help. I do not forget things like that." Julia's heart squeezed painfully. "What happened to you before you came here?" "Nothing worth talking about." Vaughn moved toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. "Thank you for the food. I will see you Sunday." Julia recognized a dismissal when she heard one. She nodded and headed for the door, but paused on the threshold. "Vaughn, you are human, and you are a good man. I hope someday you believe that." She left before he could respond, mounting her mare and riding back down the trail. She did not look back, but she felt his eyes on her the entire way. True to her word, Julia arrived the following Sunday with a basket full of fried chicken, potato salad, fresh biscuits, and apple pie made from dried apples she had hoarded. Vaughn was waiting on the porch, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. They ate on the porch in comfortable silence, watching the sun move across the sky. It became a routine. Every Sunday, Julia rode to Vaughn's cabin with a home-cooked meal. Sometimes they talked, simple conversations about the weather or the state of her garden. Sometimes they sat in silence, and Julia found that just as comfortable. Vaughn was not a man who wasted words, but when he did speak, he said things worth hearing. Weeks turned into months. Summer's brutal heat gave way to the slightly cooler days of autumn. Julia worked her small ranch with determined energy, planting a late garden, repairing fences, even managing to buy 3 chickens and a rooster with money she earned taking in mending from town. The house that had nearly slipped through her fingers became truly hers, every nail and board precious because of what it had cost. And every Sunday she rode to Vaughn's cabin. She learned things about him in small pieces, details dropped into conversations like breadcrumbs. He had come from Philadelphia, from a wealthy family that made their fortune in shipping. He had been engaged once to a woman named Catherine, who his parents had chosen for him. He had been studying law, preparing to join his father's business. Then something had happened, something he would not talk about no matter how gently Julia pressed, and he had walked away from all of it. He had spent 5 years wandering west, learning to survive in the wild until he found these hills and decided to stop moving. "Do you miss it?" Julia asked one October afternoon as they sat on his porch, shelling pecans he had gathered. "The city? Your family?" Vaughn's hand stilled on the pecans. "Miss what it could have been, not what it was. That makes no sense. Missed the idea of it, the life I thought I was building. But it was all a lie, built on things that were not real." He cracked another pecan with precise force. "Out here, things are honest. A storm will kill you or it will not. A mountain lion is dangerous or it is not. No pretending, no social games, no wondering if people smile to your face while planning to destroy you behind your back." Julia set down her own pecan. "Someone betrayed you." "Everyone betrayed me." Vaughn's voice was flat. "My fiancé, my best friend, my own father. Found them all in it together, lying and scheming and using me like a pawn. So I left. Let them have their games and their money and their perfect society lives. I wanted no part of it. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate. Vaughn looked at her and something softened in his expression. "Your turn. Tell me something real about you." Julia considered. "I'm afraid all the time. Afraid I will lose the ranch again. Afraid I cannot do this alone. Afraid that without my father, I am nothing." "You are not nothing." Vaughn's voice was fierce. "You are one of the strongest people I know. I do not feel strong. Strength is not about feeling. It is about doing what needs to be done even when you are terrified." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the contact sending electricity through her entire body. "You have more courage in your little finger than most men I have met." Julia stared at their joined hands, at the way his completely engulfed hers. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. When she looked up, she found Vaughn watching her with an intensity that made her mouth go dry. "Julia." Her name in his deep voice sounded like a prayer. "I should not what?" He pulled his hand back as if burned. "Should not forget my place. You are a respectable woman. I am a man who lives alone in the hills. People would talk." "Let them talk." The words came out before Julia could stop them, bold and reckless. Vaughn stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing and gripping it hard enough that his knuckles went white. The muscles in his back were tense beneath his shirt. "You do not understand." "Then explain it to me." "I am not a good man, Julia. I have killed men, 3 of them, back east. They were trying to kill me first, but that does not change what I did." He turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression made her chest ache. "I am exactly what people whisper about, a man with blood on his hands who ran away instead of facing the consequences." Julia stood and moved to stand beside him at the railing. "Why were they trying to kill you?" "Because I found out the truth. My fiancé and my best friend were having an affair. My father knew and approved because her family's money would save his business. When I confronted them, they decided it would be easier to kill me and make it look like an accident. I fought back. 2 of them died that night. The 3rd came after me a year later, and I killed him too." Vaughn's jaw was tight. "So yes, people should cross the street to avoid me. You should run back to your ranch and never come here again." Julia reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His hand dwarfed hers, calloused and strong. "You defended yourself. That does not make you a bad man. I ended 3 lives. They tried to end yours first." Julia squeezed his hand. "Vaughn, look at me." He did, reluctantly, those storm-gray eyes full of pain. "You saved my home. You asked nothing in return. You have been kind and patient and respectful every single week when I show up at your door. That is who you are. Not what happened back east, not the deaths of men who tried to murder you. You." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "I see you, Vaughn Blake, and I am not afraid." "You should be." But his voice was rough, almost desperate. "Well, I am not." Julia lifted her free hand and laid it against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. "I trust you. Do you trust me?" "With my life." The words were immediate, absolute. "Then trust me when I say I want to be here. Every Sunday, and maybe more than that if you will let me." Vaughn closed his eyes, and Julia watched him wrestle with something internal. When he opened them again, his expression had shifted into something raw and vulnerable. "I do not deserve you. That is not your decision to make." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. "Stubborn woman. Takes one to know one." Julia smiled up at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Vaughn lifted his hand and cupped her face, his palm rough but gentle against her cheek. "If I do this, if I let myself care for you the way I want to, I will not be able to let you go." "Good. I do not want you to let me go." He studied her face like he was memorizing every detail. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. Julia had been kissed exactly 2 before, both times by a boy in town when she was 17. Those had been fumbling, awkward things that left her wondering what all the fuss was about. This was different. This was everything. Vaughn kissed her like she was precious, like she was something miraculous he could not quite believe he got to touch. His lips were soft despite the roughness of his face, and he tasted like the coffee they had drunk earlier. One large hand cradled her face while the other settled carefully at her waist, and Julia felt surrounded by him in the best possible way. She gripped his shirt and kissed him back, pouring every ounce of feeling she'd been trying to deny into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "Julia Morgan, you are going to be the death of me." "I certainly hope not." Julia smiled, feeling light and dizzy and more alive than she had in months. "I have plans for you." "Do you now?" There was warmth in his voice, a teasing note she had never heard before. "I do, starting with you coming to my ranch for dinner next Sunday instead of me always coming here." Vaughn pulled back just far enough to look at her properly. "People will talk if they see me at your place." "Then they will talk. I do not care anymore." Julia met his eyes steadily. "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I do not care what anyone says as long as I get to see you." "Then it is settled." Julia reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "You are coming to dinner at my place, and you are going to let me show you that not everyone in the world is cruel." Vaughn caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Already showed me that, Julia. Been showing me for months. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the porch, talking and laughing and stealing kisses like teenagers. By the time Julia had to leave, the sun was setting and her face hurt from smiling. Vaughn insisted on riding back with her, not willing to let her travel alone in the dark despite her protests that she had made the journey dozens of times. When they reached her ranch, he dismounted and helped her down from her mare, his strong hands spanning her waist easily. "Next Sunday," he said, not quite a question. "Next Sunday," Julia confirmed. She stood on her toes and kissed him again, quick and sweet. "Thank you for today. Thank you for being stubborn enough not to give up on me." Julia watched him ride away, then went inside and leaned against the closed door, grinning like a fool. Her life had changed so much in the past months, from the brink of losing everything to this, to falling in love with a mountain man who thought he did not deserve happiness. She would prove him wrong about that. She would prove to Vaughn Blake that he deserved every good thing in the world. The next Sunday, Julia cooked all day, preparing a feast. Roasted chicken with herbs from her garden, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, and a chocolate cake that used up a month's worth of her sugar ration. When Vaughn arrived on horseback in the late afternoon, freshly shaved and wearing clothes that looked new, her heart skipped several beats. "You look handsome," she said, and watched a flush creep up his neck. "You look beautiful," he replied, his eyes taking in her blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions. They ate on her porch as the sun set, watching the sky turn gold and orange and deep purple. Vaughn ate like a man starved for home cooking, complimenting every dish until Julia was blushing as hard as he had earlier. After dinner, they sat in the 2 chairs her father had built, talking quietly as stars began to appear. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," Vaughn said suddenly. Julia thought about it. "Sometimes I talk to my father, out loud like he's still here. I tell him about my day, ask his advice, complain about the chickens." She laughed self-consciously. "It makes me feel less alone." Vaughn reached over and took her hand. "He would be proud of you. The way you have kept this place running, how hard you work, he would be proud." "I hope so." Julia squeezed his hand. "Your turn. Tell me something no one knows." Vaughn was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "The reason I gave you that money. It was not just about your father being kind to me." "No?" "No." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "I had been watching you. For months, even before your father died, the way you held your head high even when things were hard, the way you helped your neighbors even when you had nothing to spare, the way you never gave up. You were the bravest person I had ever seen." He paused. "I think I was already half in love with you before I ever knocked on your door with that deed." Julia's breath caught. "Vaughn, I know I should have said something sooner, but I am saying it now. I love you, Julia Morgan. I have loved you for longer than I want to admit, and I will love you for the rest of my life if you will let me." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." Vaughn stood and pulled her up into his arms, holding her against his broad chest like she was something fragile and precious. Julia wrapped her arms around his waist and held on, feeling safe in a way she had not since her father died. "Marry me," Vaughn said into her hair. "I know I am not what you deserve, but marry me anyway. Let me spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Julia pulled back just far enough to look up at him. "You already are worthy. And yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, his strong arms holding her so close she could feel every hard plane of his muscled body against her. Julia kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her love and hope and joy into the contact. When they broke apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "We should do this properly. I should court you, get the town's approval, wait a respectable amount of time. Or we could get married as soon as possible and not care what anyone thinks." Vaughn laughed, a real laugh that transformed his usually serious face. "That is my practical Julia. I have been alone long enough. I do not want to wait." Julia traced the strong line of his jaw. "Unless you want to wait. I have been waiting my whole life for you." Vaughn kissed her again, softer this time. "We will ride into town tomorrow and talk to the preacher." They sat back down, Vaughn pulling his chair close enough that he could keep his arm around Julia. They stayed there until late into the night, making plans and dreaming about their future together. The next morning, they rode into Dalhart side by side. Julia wore her best dress and held her head high as they dismounted in front of the small church. She could feel eyes on them, could hear the whispers starting already. The banker's daughter marrying the wild mountain man. It would be the scandal of the season. She found she did not care even a little bit. Reverend Patterson was a kind man in his 50s who had known Julia since she was a child. He looked surprised to see Vaughn Blake standing in his church, but recovered quickly. When they explained their intention to marry, he studied them both carefully. "This is sudden," he said finally. "Are you certain, Julia?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Mr. Blake, you understand that marriage is a sacred commitment, that Julia deserves a husband who will care for her and provide for her?" Vaughn's arm tightened around Julia's waist. "I understand, Reverend. I will spend every day of my life making sure she is happy and safe. You have my word." The Reverend looked between them, then nodded. "I can see you are both serious. When would you like the ceremony?" "As soon as possible," Julia said. "This Saturday? That gives me time to post the banns and for you both to prepare." Julia looked at Vaughn, who nodded. "Saturday is perfect," she said. They left the church to even more stares and whispers. Julia ignored them all, her hand firmly in Vaughn's as they walked to the general store. She needed fabric for a wedding dress, and Vaughn needed a proper suit. The storekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, looked shocked to see them together, but was too much of a businesswoman to turn away customers. "Congratulations," she said stiffly, as she measured out white linen for Julia's dress. "This is quite unexpected." "Love usually is," Julia replied cheerfully. Vaughn stood near the door, looking uncomfortable in the crowded store. His size made the space feel smaller, and Julia noticed how other customers gave him a wide berth. It made her angry, the way people treated him like he was dangerous when he was the gentlest man she knew. She paid for her purchases and took Vaughn's arm, steering him out into the sunshine. "Ignore them. They do not matter. They do if they make your life difficult. You make my life better." Julia stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, right there on the main street of Dalhart where anyone could see. "That's all that matters." A small smile tugged at Vaughn's lips. "You are something else, Julia Morgan." "Soon to be Julia Blake," she corrected. The smile widened into something that made her heart flip. "Julia Blake, I like the sound of that." They spent the next few days preparing. Julia sewed her wedding dress, a simple but elegant design in white linen with lace at the collar and cuffs. Vaughn cleaned his cabin from top to bottom, built a larger bed frame for the loft, and made repairs to anything that looked even slightly worn. He sold some furs and bought supplies, determined that Julia would not lack for anything. On Friday afternoon, Julia's neighbor Sarah Thompson appeared at her door with 3 other women from town. Sarah was a few years older than Julia, married to a rancher who struggled just as much as everyone else, but somehow kept going. "We heard about your wedding," Sarah said, holding up a basket. "We brought food for the reception and wanted to see if you needed help with anything." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. She had expected judgment, not kindness. "Thank you. That is very kind." The women came in and immediately took over, helping Julia finish her dress, braiding ribbons into her hair, sharing advice and stories about their own weddings. By the time they left, Julia felt less alone than she had in months. Saturday dawned clear and beautiful, the November air crisp and cool. Julia dressed carefully, her hands shaking as she buttoned the tiny buttons on her dress. She looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her dark hair was swept up with white ribbons woven through, and the dress fit perfectly. She looked like a bride, like someone starting a new life. Her father's absence hit her like a physical blow. He should have been here to walk her down the aisle, to give her away, to see her marry a good man. She pressed her hand to the wooden box that held his few possessions, wishing desperately that he could see this day. "I love him, Papa," she whispered. "He is a good man, just like you. I think you would approve." She imagined she could feel her father's blessing, warm and gentle. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the small bouquet of wildflowers Sarah had brought and headed for the church. The church was fuller than she expected, not just the women who had helped her, but other townspeople, ranchers and their families, even a few people from the shops. They watched with curious eyes as Julia walked down the aisle alone, her head held high. And at the front of the church stood Vaughn Blake. He wore a new black suit that fit his powerful frame perfectly, his dark hair neatly tied back, his beard trimmed. But it was his eyes that made Julia's breath catch. He looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, like he could not quite believe she was real. His expression held wonder and love, and something that looked almost like reverence. Julia walked to him, and he took her hands in his large ones, holding them gently. "You are beautiful," he said softly, just for her. "You're not so bad yourself," she whispered back, and was rewarded with one of his rare smiles. Reverend Patterson began the ceremony. Julia barely heard the words, too focused on Vaughn's face, on the way his thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands, on the solid reality of him standing beside her. When it came time for the vows, Vaughn's deep voice rang out clear and steady. "I, Vaughn Edward Blake, take you, Julia Eleanor Morgan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be worthy of the gift you are giving me. I promise to make you happy." Julia's voice shook as she repeated her own vows, but she meant every word. "I, Julia Eleanor Morgan, take you, Vaughn Edward Blake, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, stand beside you, and believe in you always. I promise to make our house a home. I promise to choose you every single day." Reverend Patterson smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Vaughn, you may kiss your bride." Vaughn cupped Julia's face in his large hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. The church erupted in applause, and Julia could not stop smiling as they turned to face their community as husband and wife. The reception was held in the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Julia found herself pulled from person to person, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Several women apologized for how they had treated Vaughn, admitting they had misjudged him. Vaughn stayed close to Julia's side, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but enduring it for her sake. Finally, as the sun began to set, they were able to slip away. Vaughn had brought a small wagon to carry Julia's belongings to his cabin. Their cabin now, Julia corrected herself. Their home. The ride to the cabin was quiet, both of them exhausted from the day but happy. When they arrived, Vaughn lifted Julia down from the wagon and then, before she could protest, swept her up into his arms and carried her across the threshold. "Vaughn!" Julia laughed, clinging to his neck. "Put me down." "Not yet." He carried her inside and set her carefully on her feet in the middle of the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blake." Julia looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. Vaughn had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table. He had added curtains to the windows, cheerful checked fabric that softened the rough interior. He had built shelves for her books and her few possessions. He had made space for her in his solitary life. "It is perfect," she said, turning to face him. "You are perfect." Vaughn crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Julia Blake, more than I thought I could ever love anyone." "Show me," Julia said, looking up at him through her lashes. His eyes darkened, and he kissed her with a hunger that had been restrained all day. Julia kissed him back, her fingers working at the buttons of his vest. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, learning the landscape of each other's bodies. Vaughn was gentle but passionate, treating Julia like she was both precious and desired. They came together with love and trust, and Julia understood for the first time what it meant to become one with another person. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the large bed Vaughn had built in the loft, Julia's head on his broad chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She traced the scars she had found on his body, marks from fights and survival and a hard life. "I will spend the rest of my life showing you that you are loved," Julia said softly, "that you are worthy and good and everything I could ever want." Vaughn tightened his arms around her. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret this." Julia tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "This is the happiest I have ever been." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and Julia dreamed of the future they would build together. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Julia split her time between her ranch, which she could not bear to sell, and their cabin. Vaughn helped her work the land, his strength making tasks that had exhausted her almost easy. They planted a larger garden together, fixed every fence on her property, and even managed to buy a cow and a few more chickens. Vaughn came to town more often, usually with Julia at his side. People grew accustomed to seeing them together, and slowly the whispers died down. Vaughn proved himself by helping neighbors with difficult tasks, never asking for payment, and slowly people began to see what Julia had seen from the beginning: a good man who had been hurt and deserved a second chance. The banker Harold Whitmore tried to cause trouble once, making snide comments about Julia marrying a savage mountain man. Vaughn had simply looked at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "I may be a savage, but I'm a savage who pays his debts. Can you say the same?" Whitmore had turned purple and stalked away. It became known around town that he had been adding illegal fees to foreclosures, essentially stealing from desperate people. An investigation was started, and within 6 months, Whitmore was removed from his position. A new banker took over, one who actually tried to help the struggling ranchers instead of profiting from their misfortune. Julia and Vaughn settled into a rhythm. They worked hard during the day, often side by side, and spent their evenings reading together or sitting on the porch talking. Vaughn taught Julia to shoot properly, insisting she know how to protect herself. Julia taught Vaughn to cook more than just basic survival food, and discovered he had a surprising talent for baking bread. They were happy in a quiet, profound way that Julia had never expected to find. Every morning she woke up in Vaughn's arms, and every morning she felt grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. In the spring of 1883, Julia discovered she was pregnant. She told Vaughn one evening after dinner, nervous despite knowing he would be happy. Vaughn's reaction was everything she had hoped for. He pulled her into his arms and held her so gently, like she might break, his large hand splaying across her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Julia asked. Vaughn pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his storm-gray eyes. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. Julia, you have given me everything: a home, love, a reason to believe in good things again, and now a child. I do not have words for what I am feeling." Julia kissed him, tasting salt from his tears. "I love you, Vaughn Blake, so very much." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was brutal, and Julia spent many days feeling sick and exhausted. Vaughn was endlessly patient, bringing her water, fanning her when she was hot, rubbing her feet when they swelled. He read to her for hours, his deep voice soothing. He took over most of the heavy work, insisting Julia rest. "You are growing our child," he said when she protested that she could help more. "That is work enough." As Julia's belly grew, Vaughn became increasingly protective. He did not like her riding to her ranch anymore, worried she might fall. He walked beside her wagon instead, keeping pace easily on foot. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it for hours until there was not even the slightest rough spot. He made tiny clothes with surprising skill, his large hands somehow managing delicate stitches. "Where did you learn to sew?" Julia asked one evening, watching him work on a small gown. "My mother taught me. Said a man should be able to mend his own clothes." Vaughn held up the gown, checking his stitches. "Never thought I would be making baby clothes." "You are going to be a wonderful father." Vaughn set down the sewing and moved to kneel beside Julia's chair, taking her hand. "I'm terrified. What if I do something wrong? What if I'm not good enough?" Julia cupped his face, feeling the rasp of his beard against her palms. "You are going to be perfect. You are kind and patient and strong. Our child will be so lucky to have you as a father." In October, Julia went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Vaughn stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, supporting her when she needed to walk, murmuring encouragement. Sarah Thompson came to help, having delivered several babies herself, and she directed Vaughn like a general commanding troops. "You are doing so well," Vaughn kept saying, kissing Julia's forehead, her hands anywhere he could reach. "You are so strong. I love you so much." When their son finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, Vaughn wept openly. He cut the cord with shaking hands and then held his son with a reverence that made Julia's heart overflow. "He is perfect," Vaughn said, staring at the tiny baby in his massive hands. "Julia, he is perfect." They named him Thomas William Blake, after both their fathers. Tommy was a healthy, loud baby who clearly had his father's lungs. Vaughn was instantly smitten, spending hours just holding his son, studying every tiny feature. "He has your eyes," Julia said one night, watching Vaughn cradle Tommy against his broad chest. "Had he tanned your nose." Vaughn touched the tiny button nose gently. "And hopefully your disposition. One stubborn Blake in this family is enough," Julia laughed. "I think we both know he is going to be just like you." As Tommy grew, it became clear Julia was right. He was a calm, observant baby who studied everything with serious gray eyes. He rarely cried unless he was hungry or tired, and he seemed happiest when held by his father. Vaughn carried Tommy everywhere in a sling Julia made, the tiny baby looking impossibly small against his father's massive frame. When Tommy was 6 months old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier. She knew what to expect, and Vaughn was even more attentive than before. He barely let her lift anything heavier than a teacup, earning him teasing from Julia and Sarah both. "I am not made of glass," Julia protested when Vaughn refused to let her carry a basket of laundry. "No, but you are carrying our child, and I will not risk anything happening to either of you." Vaughn took the basket from her. "Let me help. Please." How could she argue with that? Their daughter was born in the spring of 1885, a quick and comparatively easy birth that left Sarah shaking her head in amazement. Emma Rose Blake had her mother's dark hair and her father's strong will, making her presence known with lusty cries from the moment she arrived. "She has spirit," Vaughn said, cradling his daughter with the same gentle reverence he had shown Tommy. "She's going to keep us on our toes." He was right. Emma was a force of nature from the beginning, demanding attention and affection with equal intensity. Tommy, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Vaughn had to watch him carefully to make sure his help did not turn into accidentally smothering Emma with love. Life became beautifully chaotic. The cabin that had once held just Vaughn now overflowed with family. Toys littered the floor, baby clothes dried on lines outside, the sounds of children laughing and crying filled spaces that had been silent for so long. Julia and Vaughn were exhausted most days, but happy in a bone-deep way. They eventually sold Julia's ranch to a young couple just starting out, using the money to expand their cabin and buy more land around it. Vaughn built on 2 more rooms, one for the children to share and one for guests. He built a larger barn for the animals they had accumulated. He dug a root cellar and lined it with stone. He turned his solitary refuge into a family home. Julia planted flower gardens around the cabin, adding splashes of color to the rugged landscape. She hung curtains in every window and filled the shelves with books. She made quilts and rugs and cushions, softening the rough edges. Together, they created something neither had thought possible, a home filled with love and laughter. Tommy grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive. Emma grew into a wild, fearless girl who climbed trees and caught snakes and refused to wear dresses if she could help it. They were different in every way, but completely devoted to each other. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Vaughn surprised Julia by taking her back to the church where they had married. Tommy and Emma stayed with Sarah for the afternoon, and Julia and Vaughn stood in the empty church, holding hands. "5 years ago you saved my life," Julia said softly. "Not just by keeping my home, but by showing me what love really means." Vaughn brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You saved me too. I was so lost, so convinced I did not deserve happiness. You proved me wrong every single day. I love you more now than I did when we married. I did not think that was possible, but it is. I love you more too." Vaughn pulled her close, wrapping his strong arms around her. "You are my home, Julia. You and Tommy and Emma. You are everything I never knew I needed." They renewed their vows right there in the empty church, promising again to love and cherish each other. Then Vaughn took Julia to the hotel in town, where he had rented a room for the night. It was a rare luxury, having time alone together, and they made the most of it. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. A drought one summer tested their resilience, but they survived by rationing carefully and helping their neighbors. A harsh winter trapped them in the cabin for weeks, but they turned it into an adventure, telling stories and playing games with the children. Tommy started school in town, riding in with Vaughn every morning. Emma declared school was boring and tried to convince her parents to let her stay home, but Julia was firm. "Education is important," she told her daughter. "You need to learn to read and write and do sums." "But Papa did not go to school much and he knows everything," Emma protested. Vaughn knelt down to look his daughter in the eye. "I went to school for many years," Emma rose, "and I still use what I learned every day. Your mother is right. Education will open doors for you that would otherwise stay closed." Emma went to school, though she remained convinced it was a waste of time better spent exploring. When Tommy was 8 and Emma was 6, Julia became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the others, leaving her weak and sick for months. Vaughn was terrified something would go wrong, and he barely left her side. Tommy and Emma tried to help, doing chores without being asked and keeping quiet when their mother was resting. The baby, another boy they named Daniel James Blake, arrived a month early. He was tiny and fragile, and for the first few days, no one was sure he would survive. Vaughn held his youngest son against his chest constantly, his body heat helping to keep the premature baby warm. He prayed, something Julia had never heard him do, pleading with God to let his son live. Daniel survived. He was small but determined, fighting his way to health with stubborn persistence. By the time he was 3 months old, he had caught up to where he should be, and the doctor declared him completely healthy. Julia and Vaughn breathed easier, though Vaughn remained extra protective of his youngest. With 3 children, life was even more chaotic. The cabin rang with noise and energy from dawn to dusk. Vaughn built onto it again, adding another bedroom so each child could have their own space eventually. He built a larger table so they could all eat together. He reinforced the porch so it could hold the entire family. Julia taught all 3 children to read and write, holding lessons at the kitchen table every morning. She taught them to cook and clean and manage a household. She told them stories about their grandparents, making sure they knew the sacrifices that had been made for them. Vaughn taught them to survive in the wilderness, to respect nature, to be strong but gentle. He taught them to defend themselves, but also when to walk away from a fight. He taught them that strength was not just physical, but also moral, that the hardest thing was often the right thing. Tommy grew into a young man who looked more like his father every day, tall and broad-shouldered, with serious gray eyes and a quiet disposition. Emma remained wild and free, more comfortable in the wilderness than in town, able to outride and outshoot most of the boys her age. Daniel was the peacemaker, the one who could make anyone smile, blessed with his mother's warmth and his father's strength. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Julia and Vaughn took a trip alone together, leaving the children with Sarah. They rode up into the mountains Vaughn had once called home, higher than Julia had ever been. They camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and Vaughn told Julia stories about his years alone before she had changed everything. "I thought I was happy," he said as they lay in their bedroll, wrapped in each other's arms. "I thought being alone was what I wanted. Then you walked into my life with your stubborn pride and your brave heart, and you showed me I had been just surviving, not living." "You saved me first," Julia reminded him. "You gave me back my home." "I gave you back a house. You gave me a home. There is a difference." Vaughn kissed her temple. "Everything good in my life comes from you, Julia. Everything." They made love under the stars, as passionate as they had been on their wedding night despite 10 years of marriage. The love between them had not diminished, but deepened, becoming something solid and permanent and true. When they returned home, the children greeted them with enthusiasm, all talking at once about what they had done while their parents were gone. Vaughn lifted Daniel onto his shoulders while Tommy and Emma clung to Julia, and Julia felt her heart might burst from happiness. This was her life now, this beautiful, chaotic, love-filled life with a man who had once thought himself unworthy of happiness. They had built something real together, something that would last. Years continued to flow like water, each one bringing changes. Tommy fell in love with the daughter of another rancher, a sweet girl named Margaret who looked at him like he hung the moon. Vaughn gave his blessing, and they married when Tommy was 22. Emma declared she would never marry, preferring her freedom, though Julia suspected that would change when the right man came along. Daniel grew into a young man who wanted to be a doctor, inspired by the doctor who had helped save his life. "It will mean going away to school," Daniel said nervously at dinner one night. "In Dallas or maybe even back east." Vaughn was quiet for a long moment, and Julia could see the conflict on his face. His son wanted to return to the world Vaughn had fled from. Finally, Vaughn reached across the table and gripped Daniel's shoulder. "If that is your dream, then you should chase it. The world owes you nothing, Daniel. You have to take what you want and work for what you need. Your mother and I will support you however we can." Daniel's education was expensive, but they made it work. Vaughn sold furs and did work for other ranchers. Julia took in sewing and sold eggs and vegetables in town. Tommy and Margaret helped where they could. The whole family came together to make sure Daniel could follow his dream. When Daniel left for Dallas at 18, Julia cried for a week. Vaughn held her through it, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Their baby was grown and leaving home, chasing a future they had worked so hard to give him. "We did a good job," Vaughn said one night as they sat on their porch, the same porch where they had fallen in love so many years ago. All three of them. We gave them everything they needed to make their own way in the world. "I know." Julia leaned against his solid shoulder. "It does not make it easier." "No, but it is the right kind of pain, the pain of letting go so they can fly." Emma eventually did fall in love with a cavalry soldier stationed at a nearby fort. He was a good man who respected her wild nature and did not try to change her. They married in a simple ceremony and moved to Montana when he was transferred. Emma promised to write every week, and she did, her letters full of adventures in her new home. Tommy and Margaret gave Julia and Vaughn their first grandchild, a little girl they named Julia after her grandmother. Watching Vaughn hold his granddaughter, seeing the same wonder on his face that had been there when he held his own children, made Julia fall in love with him all over again. "I never thought I would have this," Vaughn said, cradling the baby with practiced ease. "A family, grandchildren, a life worth living. I thought I was meant to be alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Julia said, touching his face. "You just had not found your family yet." Daniel finished his medical training and returned to Texas, opening a practice in a town about a day's ride from Dalhart. He made a point of visiting once a month, bringing stories about the people he was helping and the lives he was saving. He eventually married a teacher, an intelligent woman who shared his passion for helping others. As Julia and Vaughn grew older, they slowed down but never stopped. Vaughn's dark hair went gray, then white, but his strength remained. He could still split firewood with the best of them, still ride all day without tiring. Julia's face gained wrinkles and her hands developed arthritis, but her spirit never dimmed. They worked their land, welcomed their growing number of grandchildren, and loved each other with the same intensity they always had. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Tommy and Margaret came with their 4 children. Emma and her husband traveled from Montana with their 3 children. Daniel arrived with his wife and their 2 children. The cabin that had once held just one lonely man now overflowed with love and laughter and family. Vaughn stood on the porch, surveying his family with an expression of such profound contentment that Julia had to blink back tears. She moved to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Look what we built," she said softly. Vaughn squeezed her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "Look what you built. None of this would exist without you, Julia. You took a broken man and showed him how to be whole again. You gave me a reason to believe in love and family and good things. Every person here exists because you were brave enough to see something worth saving in me." "We saved each other," Julia corrected, "and we built this together." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Julia and Vaughn sat on their porch like they had done thousands of times before. The stars were bright overhead, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Vaughn's arm was around Julia's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest. "Do you remember the first time I came to your ranch?" Vaughn asked. "When I brought you the deed? I remember thinking you were the most terrifying and the kindest man I had ever met." Vaughn chuckled. "I was terrified. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but when I actually saw you standing there, so proud and brave even though your world was falling apart, I forgot every word. You did fine. You saved my life that day, and you saved mine every day after." Vaughn kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Julia Blake. More than I did yesterday, more than I did 30 years ago. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "I love you too," Julia said, feeling the truth of it in every fiber of her being. Forever and always. They sat there until the stars began to fade with approaching dawn, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life more beautiful than either had dreamed possible. Julia Morgan had been on the verge of losing everything when Vaughn Blake appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. He had been a broken man convinced he did not deserve happiness. Together, they had healed each other's wounds and built something that would last for generations. The foreclosure notice that had once represented the end of Julia's world had actually been the beginning of a love story that proved even the most damaged hearts could heal when they found the right person. Beginning of a family that would grow and flourish and carry forward the legacy of two people who had refused to give up. As the sun rose over the Texas hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Julia and Vaughn remained on their porch, holding each other close. Around them, their cabin filled with the sounds of their family waking, grandchildren laughing, their children preparing breakfast, life continuing in all its beautiful chaos. The house that had almost been lost now stood strong and full of love, a testament to what could be built when two people chose each other and refused to let go. The mountain man who had once lived alone now had a family that adored him. The woman who had faced losing everything now had more than she had ever imagined possible. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the struggles they had faced or the hardships they had overcome, but the love they had found and the life they had built together. Julia and Vaughn Blake had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created something extraordinary. As they watched the sunrise together, surrounded by the family that existed because they had been brave enough to love each other, Julia knew with absolute certainty that every hard moment had been worth it. Every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt had led them here, to this perfect morning with their entire family under one roof. "Happy anniversary, my love," Vaughn murmured, pulling Julia closer. "Happy anniversary," Julia replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. And as their lips met, bathed in the golden light of a new day, two people who had saved each other in every way that mattered celebrated 30 years of a love that had transformed both their lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The deed to Julia's property still hung framed on the wall of their bedroom, a reminder of where their journey had begun. But the real treasure was not written on that piece of paper. It was in the laughter of their grandchildren, the strength of their children, the love between two people who had found each other when they both needed it most. Julia Eleanor Blake had been given back her property by a mountain man with a heart bigger than his massive frame. Vaughn Edward Blake had been given back his faith in humanity by a stubborn woman who refused to let him believe he was anything less than worthy. Together, they had built a life, a family, and a love story for the ages. And they lived happily, surrounded by those they loved, for all the years they had remaining. When Julia eventually passed at the age of 78, she died in Vaughn's arms, still holding his hand just as she had on their wedding day. Vaughn followed her just 6 months later, unable to exist in a world without the woman who had been his everything. Their children buried them side by side on the hill overlooking their cabin, under the shade of an oak tree Vaughn had planted the year they were married. The headstone bore a simple inscription, "Together forever," and the family they had created continued to gather at that cabin every year, sharing stories about the banker who foreclosed on a property, the mountain man who bought it back and put her name on the deed, and the love story that began with an act of kindness and lasted for all eternity. Their legacy was not measured in money or property or material things. It was measured in the generations of children who learned what real love looked like, in the example they set of choosing each other every single day, in the proof that even the most broken people can find healing when they find the right person to love. Julia and Vaughn Blake had started with nothing and ended with everything that mattered. And their story, passed down through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, became a legend in Dalhart, Texas, a reminder that love can find you in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a mountain man with a kind heart and a woman brave enough to love him back.